Hello, Admiral Stavridis. It's so great to have you here today in our studio. So, Admiral, you are a retired four-star U.S. naval officer. You led the NATO alliance in global operations from 2009 to 2013 as Supreme Allied Commander. You also served as Commander of U.S. Southern Command. And throughout your 37 years of military career, you earned more than 50 medals. That's quite an impressive profile. But as we were chatting just now, you also have connection with Chinese Americans in your family. Can you first talk a little bit about your family? What's that family like?
Well, I have two daughters, Lizzie, and thank you for having me on. And what I mentioned a moment ago is my eldest daughter, who is an executive at a tech company, is married to a physician whose name is Jimmy Wang. And so my son-in-law is Chinese American, and they have two adorable children, a little girl, Lily, who is almost 3, and a little boy, Peter, who is almost 1. So I feel very connected to the Chinese American community.
Thank you so much.
This, when I hosted the wedding, as is traditional, and I'm Greek American, and of course my new in-laws and family are the Chinese American. I felt as though if it were movies, it was The Last Emperor meets My Big Fat Greek Wedding. And it was a wonderful, wonderful wedding where you saw these two cultures come together. So again, I feel very connected to the Chinese American community, and I'm glad I'm with you today.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure our audience will really appreciate you sharing that part of the story. But unbeknownst to many of us, you're also a novel writer, right? You recently published a techno thriller, 2034. So tell us a little more about that novel. What inspired you to write a novel? And can you briefly introduce the storyline without giving out all the details?
Thank you for asking about my novel. It's my 10th book, but my first novel. And I was inspired to write it, Lizzie, by looking back at the history of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And there was a rich literature associated with that. Films like Dr. Strangelove, books like Failsafe, the Bedford Incident, the Third World War. And I think part of the reason we never had a war, a hot war, during the Cold War was because of that literature, because we could imagine how terrible that scenario would be. So I thought perhaps there is an opportunity to write a book, a novel, that is not predictive. I'm not trying to predict the future. It's a cautionary tale. I'm trying to warn us about a future. So the book is about a war between the US and China that occurs in the year 2034. And the setup is, it's about 15 years from the present into the future. China has continued on a path of global activities and expanding trade around the world. And there comes more and more tension and collision between the United States and China. And the flashpoint, as you will appreciate, since you understand the dynamics of the two countries, the flashpoint becomes the South China Sea, which China claims as territorial waters. The US disagrees with that, believes these are international waters. And the book opens up with a group of American destroyers conducting a freedom of navigation patrol through the South China Sea. They encounter a Chinese merchant ship, an incident occurs, and then the ladder of escalation goes up and up and up. So the book begins with provocations from both sides, the US conducting these freedom of navigation, China responding, and then through miscalculation, the two nations sleepwalk, they stumble into a war that is to neither nation's benefit. I hasten to say, this is a book without good guys and bad guys. In this book, the villain is war, and war occurs because of miscalculation on both sides.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, the book really is a cautionary tale. So what makes you think a novel is the best vessel for that kind of story? Why can't it be a policy paper?
I'll give you 3 reasons. One is policy papers tend to be kind of boring. They're kind of dry. They don't get wide circulation. So I thought to myself, why not use a format where many more people would be interested in reading about it? Number two, this novel, 2034, is very much character driven. So you meet a Chinese admiral, Lin Bao. You meet a deputy national security advisor who's Indian American, Sandy Chowdhury. You meet a woman who is the commodore of this group of Navy destroyers, Sarah Hunt. The president of the United States is a woman, but she's not a Republican or a Democrat. By bringing characters into the telling of the story, again, I think you open it up to a larger audience. And third and finally, with fiction, you can take some liberties with some of the technology. Nothing has to be perfect. You don't have to have footnotes after everything. It just allows you, if you were an artist, it gives you a much bigger canvas upon which to paint.
That makes total sense. Thank you so much for the answer. So when I was reading the book, it just reminds me of Professor Ellison of Harvard's this book, The Thucydides Trap, Are the U.S. and China Headed for War? I attended Professor Ellison's lecture when I was a student, and he argued that based on the current trajectory, war between the United States and China in the decades ahead is not just possible, it's actually much more likely than recognized at the moment. So first question for you, do you agree with that assessment? Do you believe antipathy between democracy and totalitarianism will inevitably lead to war?
Well, let's start by looking at history. And what Professor Allison does is look back 2,500 years ago to the ancient Greeks. As I mentioned a moment ago, I'm Greek American. I think I understand the world of Athens and Sparta 2,500 years ago pretty well. That was the first time that we see an established power being challenged by a rising power. That created a war. It was called the Peloponnesian War, and it was, in effect, a world war of that time. Well, if you come forward from 2,500 years ago, and you look at every time there is an established power challenged by a rising power, in many, many cases, out of the 18 that we can identify, in 12 of those cases, a global war occurs. The last time this happened was just about 100 years ago. Established power, the United Kingdom; rising power, Germany, the Kaiser's Germany. They went to war, despite the fact that neither nation really had any significant benefit that it could take from that war. They stumbled into war. They sleepwalked into that war without realizing how terrible it would be. So history tells us it's a dangerous situation when an established power, the United States, is challenged by a rising power, China. So history tells us that be careful. And then secondly, if you look at the trend lines of where China is going as it expands and conducts what is sometimes called One Belt, One Road, a geoeconomic strategy globally, as I mentioned earlier, it creates points of tension and stress between the United States and China. And third and finally, about 15 years from now, my assessment is that China will have very capable military tools at its disposal. Offensive cyber capability fired by quantum computing, space assets, and above all, a powerful, capable Navy with long-range air and missiles. So when you put all that together, Lizzie, we need to think carefully about what a war might look like, how we could fall into it, and if we think about it correctly and intelligently, I maintain we have a better chance of avoiding that war. That's really the point of 2034.
Gotcha. Thank you for that answer. So I wanted to turn to policy a little bit. Admiral, you are known for your ability to bridge political gaps and partisan gaps. In 2016, you were vetted for vice president by Hillary Clinton. You were also invited to take a cabinet post in the Trump administration. So that spoke to your ability and the respect you receive by both sides. So you're really the best person we have to ask that question. Speaking of the United States challenges confronted by the country right now, faced by U.S. citizens from both sides of the aisle, what do you think is the greatest strength, and what do you think is the greatest vulnerability that we face right now?
Well, let me back up and answer a larger question, which is the United States declining as a world power? I think the answer to that is not yet. If you look at the assets of the United States, we are a very large continental nation. We have abundant natural resources, arable land, water, minerals, oil, gas. We're the largest exporter of energy in the world. We have geography is on our side. We have two vast oceans on either side of us. We have warm relations with our neighbors to the north and south. We have a very innovative population. We have a relatively young population. Our demographics are still relatively strong. People want to come here. We have challenges at our southern border, but we ought to remember that's because people desperately want to come to this country. Very few other places in the world can say that wherever you go to visit an American embassy, anywhere in the world, you will see lines of people seeking visas to move here permanently. So it's a pretty good hand of cards. But what hurts us, and here's where we get to your question, is the polarization in our nation, the tendency to turn everything into a bitter, angry debate. That's a mistake. This is something I think China does reasonably well, is create a shared sense of the country, a shared sense of civilization, if you will. In the United States, we are having a great deal of difficulty getting everybody on the same sheet of music, to use an expression. So the question becomes, what should we do about it? And I would say, if we can surmount this polarization in our nation, our future is still very bright. To address it, we need, frankly, as voters, my view, to look for candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, who are willing to reach across the aisle and work with the other side. We need to invest in education. At the end of the day, the social inequalities and the social injustice that we have here is driven in many ways by disparities in education. That can be addressed. And thirdly, we need to celebrate the ideas of service, not just the military service, but all who serve, our police, our firemen, our diplomats, our intelligence officers, our police and firemen, our doctors and nurses on the front line of COVID. There are so many ways to serve the country. Service is nonpartisan. Service is bipartisan. So we have work to do, but I think if we work collectively to turn down the temperature, to reach across the aisles, to address some of these inequalities in our society, I think the future remains bright for the United States. We'll see.
I see. Thank you for that answer. And on to U.S.-China relationships. As you know, in the last 4 years, the relations between the two countries have been very tumultuous. So now on to the Biden administration. Do you think the bilateral relationship between U.S. and China can ever recover from 4 years of Trump administration? And do you give credit to the Trump administration for finally standing up to China, some of China's practices, especially in the trade area? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I think the answer is a little bit of both. We ought to give the Trump administration credit for facing the challenges, but we ought to criticize the Trump administration in that the solution was so tactical, so episodic. 1 minute, we're slapping on new tariffs. The next minute, President Xi is dining with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago and they're best friends. It's just back and forth. There was no strategic plan. What the Biden administration is doing very methodically, because this is a very experienced team that's coming in, is building a plan in order to have a relationship with China that is realistic, that sees the challenges, but also is willing to find zones of cooperation. A way to summarize it might be, I think the new administration will confront China where it feels it must. Example, China's claims of ownership in the South China Sea. But I think the Biden administration will cooperate wherever it can. A good example would be climate. I think that is a zone of real potential cooperation between the two nations. So I think you'll see the Biden team construct a strategy which will include military, diplomatic, economic, cultural, communications tools that'll be threaded together. And the basis of the strategy will be confront where we must, where we have real differences, cooperate wherever we can so we can defuse the tension that comes out of the confrontation. I think that's the best path forward to avoid the events in 2034.
Gotcha. So speaking of policy making, can you tell us a little more about the China hands in the Biden cabinet? Based on your interactions with them and what you know about them, how are they likely to be different from their counterparts in the previous administration, people like Matt Pottinger or Miles Yu?
Yeah, this is a new team, but it's also an old team. In other words, almost everybody who is now in the Biden administration had a very significant job in the Obama administration. Now you can criticize, and I have, some of the things that happened in the Obama administration, but the most important point is that this is a group of people who know each other, have worked together very effectively, who have a kind of collective philosophy of let's turn down the temperature. We used to say about President Obama, no drama Obama. That's kind of the mantra of this Biden team. They don't take things personally. They are going to want to work collectively, and they are looking for ways that we avoid the events in 2034 without completely capitulating to China's positions. I think they'll be quite capable of doing that. Rather than focus on the entire team, let me just mention two people that I think will be particularly important. One is a man named Kurt Campbell. Kurt was at State Department. He's been at the Pentagon. He's a long Asia expert, and particularly knows China very, very well. He'll be very important. And his position is he is in charge of Asia on the National Security Council staff. So he'll report directly to Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and under Kurt will be three senior directors, one of whom will focus exclusively on China-US relations. So we will have the structure in place. Kurt Campbell will be key in that regard. And the other person I would point out is our new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who was the Deputy Secretary of State and very much part of the intellectual grounding in what has been called the pivot to Asia. This was an attempt by the Obama administration to get out of the Middle East and focus on Asia. That never really got traction for a variety of reasons, but Tony Blinken was the architect of the Pacific pivot. He is now the Secretary of State, having moved up from Deputy Secretary of State. So it's an experienced team, a collegial team. They understand Asia. I think the strategy will be confront where we must, but let's find some ways to cooperate. I'll close. One other important person in this equation is the former Secretary of State, John Kerry. Secretary Kerry is now going to be the climate czar for the entire administration. And as a result, he has a very vested interest in his portfolio in ensuring that US-China work together on climate. here's the significant point. For the first time, we have a climate czar, but that climate czar has a seat on the National Security Council staff. On the National Security Council, not the staff. So there, he will be there with the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, secretary of defense, secretary of the treasury, and the climate director. That's a very significant position. He will be a voice for working with China. Again, this is an administration that will, I think, find the balance between a totally episodic and a much more structural approach.
I see. Thank you for the answer. So finally, let's look into the future a little bit. As you know, the Biden administration will hold its first high-level meeting with Chinese officials in Alaska later this week. What results do you expect from that two-day meeting?
I think it'll be low-key. Here's an important point to bear in mind. During this week, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense are going around Asia together. But the meeting in Alaska will drop the Secretary of Defense off the ticket, so to speak. So now it'll be the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. I think that's significant. I think it's the administration signaling to China, look, we're not going to bring the military into this first set of meetings. So what you're going to have is Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, very experienced diplomats. Jake Sullivan formerly headed the policy planning staff at State Department. Tony Blinken, former Deputy Secretary of State. They come at this from a diplomat's perspective. I think what we will hear as a result is a mixed picture, but it'll go something like this. We spoke with our Chinese counterparts. We confirmed with them that we are deeply concerned about human rights questions, treatment of Uyghurs. We confirmed that we do not accept the Chinese position of ownership on the South China Sea. We pushed back on cyber activities, including recent hacks. But we also found that we can cooperate going forward on climate. We have talked about cooperation on preparing for the next pandemic. It'll be kind of a mixed picture that'll reflect a philosophy of confront realistically and with clear eyes where we must, but cooperate wherever we can. I think that is what we'll hear coming out. This is just the first round. You know, they say in Afghanistan, 3 cups of tea. The first one is when you meet. The second one is when you get to know. By the third cup of tea, there's real friendship. Let's hope that's how it goes. This is the first cup of tea.
I see. Thank you so much for this conversation. Super insightful. Thank you, Admiral. And we'll make sure to include a link to your book in the show notes section so our interested audience can take a look at the book, 2034. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll give it a big push on our social networks. Thank you. Those are very good questions. Very thoughtful and well laid out. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Awesome.
Lizzi.
Bye.